So as you know, Joyce and Sam are on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and I'm in the northern part of Manhattan. Some people call it upstate, but it's still in Manhattan. We're in Inwood, so we're far upstate. But we're all together with all of you, wherever you are. So I have to admit, it was complicated for me to think about how to talk about events this week, how to teach them Torah. And there are many different ways I can get in, but the Torah portion always is the grounding place to be. In this week's Parsha, we begin the second book of the 5 books of Moses, the book of Exodus, as it's known, or Shemot in Hebrew. And in the story, we transfer from the stories of Joseph's family and what happens to Joseph and his brothers to the national story of the Israelite people who have moved to Egypt. And the Pharaoh is replaced by a new Pharaoh. A new Pharaoh arose in Egypt who did not know Joseph, who did not know Joseph's family. And a new Pharaoh takes over the government. And we're told in the first words in the beginning of the Parsha, not the exact first word, but very early on in the Parsha, it says, Pharaoh begins speaking badly about the Israelites. Now remember, the Israelites, our ancestors, had lived very comfortably in Egypt. One of their own was the second in command of the entire country. But then things changed. And the first things that happened long before the Israelites are made into the enslaved peoples that we became. The Pharaoh started speaking badly about us. And what did he say? How did Pharaoh start speaking about us? So it begins in verse 8 and in verse 9. The Pharaoh says, Vayomer el amo. He said, he spoke. This is exactly what we talk about Kristallnacht. The first thing that happens is propaganda, is language, is fake facts. He said to his people, the Israelites are too numerous. They're getting too comfortable. Let us deal shrewdly with them so that they will not increase in number, because if they increase in number, they are to be suspected, because in the event of war, they will join our enemies and fight against us, and they are our enemy. And if we allow them to do that, they will destroy us. That's how Pharaoh begins. I'm a proud member of Trua. In fact, I'm the founding co-chair of Trua, which is the rabbinic organization for human rights here in the United States. And Trua's slogan, which Randy and I have on our door of our apartment, which is Trua's slogan, which we love very much, resisting tyrants since Pharaoh. Pharaoh really is the first tyrant that we as a people know. And the model of the fighting of Pharaoh has become the model for many, many peoples who have experienced oppressive governments and oppression around the world. And after all, Dr. King himself, and next week we celebrate Dr. King's Day. We have a Martin Luther King Day Shabbat next Friday night. King himself explored the Exodus theology, the story of this book of the Bible, as the source of inspiration to understand what it would mean for African Americans to move from being an enslaved people to being a free people. And he knew in the exploration of that story, which we begin tonight in the cycle of our people, that it's not a linear progression that goes from the depths of despair to the heights of freedom quickly. And it's not a story that can be told without witnessing a great deal of pain. And part of his vision and his teaching was that we had to withstand a lot of suffering in order to get from a place of oppression to a place of freedom. And are we prepared to do that? And that's how he insisted over and over again. And this is one of the truths of the struggles of any people who move from slavery to freedom. I read from the New York Times today, Erin Schaff, who is a staff photographer, describing her experience on Wednesday. I looked down the hall to the rotunda and saw what looked like 100 people running around, yelling and pulling around a podium. I took a bunch of photographs and then went to the ceremonial doors to the rotunda, where a single police officer guarded the door against a throng of hundreds outside. The mob massed together and rushed the officer, forcing open the door, and people flooded in. I ran upstairs to be out of the way of the crowd and to hopefully get a better vantage point to document what was happening. Suddenly, 2 or 3 men in black surrounded me and demanded to know who I worked for. Grabbing my press pass, they saw that my ID said the New York Times, and they became really angry. They threw me to the floor, trying to take my cameras. I started screaming for help as loudly as I could. No one came. People just watched. At this point, I thought I could be killed, and no one would stop them. They ripped one of my cameras from me, broke a lens on the other, and they ran away. After that, I was hyperventilating, not sure what to do. I knew I needed to get away from the mob and hide my broken camera so I wouldn't be targeted again. I ran into Speaker Pelosi's suite, but people were vandalizing her office, so I kept moving. Walking out to her balcony facing west toward the National Mall, I saw a mass of people covering the inaugural stage. I found a spot to hide my camera and then watched the crowd from the balcony and filming from my phone, which was all I had left. "This will be the start of a civil war revolution," a man next to me said. At that point, the Capitol Police started deploying pepper spray and tear gas, and I knew I needed to find a place to hide. I didn't know where I could go. Since I no longer had my congressional credentials, I ran to the 3rd floor, opened the first door I saw, and hid in a hallway. I called my husband, who told me to stay calm and find a safer spot. By then, the police found me. I told them I was a photojournalist and that my pass had been stolen, but they didn't believe me. They drew their guns on me, pointed them, and yelled at me to get down on my hands and knees. As I lay on the ground, 2 other photojournalists came into the hall and started shouting, "She's a journalist!" The officers told us it wasn't safe to even leave. They helped us to then find a room and told us to barricade ourselves in. The 2 other photographers grabbed my hands and told me it would be okay, and to stay with them so they would vouch for me. I will never forget their kindness in that moment. Aaron Schaff, staff photographer. There are so many individual stories of the nightmare of what was Wednesday. There are so many ways to approach and to understand the horror of what happened then. And again, we have to hold these multiple truths. That on the same day that a group of insurrectionists, of seditious thugs, fed, incited by the President of the United States, went searching, hunting, breaking into the Capitol building, this very same day, the first African American, the first Jew, the 2 Democrats voted into office by the state of Georgia. And we, human beings, have to carry it all. Now, of course, we have been staying here in our synagogue since the day he was elected that Trump would exhibit authoritarian, fascist style of government. We here have not pretended or looked away. And I said to you then, the night he was elected, the night after he was elected, we understood what we were in for. We understood he would do everything to dismantle the agencies of government in order to serve only his wealth and his power. That Friday after he was elected, we, CBST, the LGBTQ synagogue, what did we do? We went to the mosque to stand there to say, this man whose first speech announcing his candidacy was anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant. We knew from the beginning we needed to stand together with our Muslim, our immigrant friends. We understood how he would use racism and how he would use the tools of government to only create chaos and destruction. I said then, very early on, that I stood for his impeachment and supported it when it was happening. And we have survived to this moment. There are still children who do not know where their families are and families who do not know where their children are. He has been engaging in language of hate and lies and corruption The expression of violence is the logical next step. I have said it was going to be bad, and yet we have created a community that has served as an ark, as a teva, to take us, to carry us through these terrible waters of the tsunami of Donald Trump's America. It doesn't mean each one of us will survive. And in this nightmare of COVID, we've had losses here in the synagogue, our families and friends. And Joyce Rosenzweig just told me a friend of hers just died this week from COVID without preparation or even, it was a very sudden onset of COVID. And we know that these next couple of months, COVID will be terrible. We know that. And we also know the power of building an ark. What was, after all, the first ark? In this week's Parsha, we know that the baby Moses is put in a small ark. And these women who saved him understood he needed to be saved because he had a job to do. And their job was to save him. And then his job then becomes to free the slaves. And that is how life works. Each of us has to do our particular job, not knowing exactly where the ripples will end up, but understanding that if you are alive now, it's because you have something to offer the world. What those women did is that they put him in an ark, in a small ark, in the river. He was then saved by another woman. He grew up to be a human being of compassion and then of vision. But where does his vision come from? In this week's Parsha, we're told he is running away from Egypt, and he decides to lead a very private and personal life, and he is a shepherd to sheep for his father-in-law, away in the desert, away from human beings, where the quiet allows him to hear the calling in his heart. And we're told he's wandering around looking for a lost sheep when he encounters a sneh, a bush, that is burning but not consumed. The language of this part of the Parsha moves me every year that we read it, because it says he's engaged in the daily tasks of his work life. He's a shepherd, he's out taking care of sheep. And he passes a bush that's burning but not consumed. But what he does that's different, the text makes it sound like the bush has always been burning, and maybe it's always not being consumed. But what he does, which is different than every other human being that might have passed that particular sneh, is that the text tells us that he stopped, he turned, and he looked. That is our task as human beings, to stop and turn and look. And then he saw the miracle that was there, which was a bush that was burning and not being consumed. How do we stop and see the miracles around us and understand what they teach us? It's easy to be totally consumed by the news that shows us the disaster of the world in which we're living. But at the same time, we have to stop long enough to see the miracles that will give us the vision of what we have to do. And Moses understood at that moment that he was encountering something, and he had to listen really carefully. God identifies God's self to Moses at that point and says, Ehyeh asher ehyeh. I will be what I will be. The mystery of God's presence in our lives is, what do we need God to be to give us the strength? Some of us need drama, and some of us need quiet. Sharon Brous has said this week, the great rabbi from Los Angeles, that the only way that we will be able to recover from this moment in our history, to truly heal as a nation, Sharon Brous says, we must have a deep national reckoning. We can't just move on from where we are this week. We can't just move on from these 4 years. There needs to be a profound and a deep national reckoning. We need to be able to look deeply at the conditions which have created both the monsters that acted in ways they did on Wednesday and the racism that has established so much despair And there is no shortcut here, Sharon Brous says. It's not only the recklessness, fecklessness, and shocking criminality of the president and his enablers that got us here. Silence and complicity are also sins. Either we work to dismantle oppressive systems, or our inaction becomes the mortar that sustains them. In times like this, the vision of a just and loving multiracial democracy may seem fantastical or even farcical. We have to remember Psalm 30, that joy does come in the morning. We can transform the tearful night into a joyous morning. I believe this to be possible. To bring on this new dawn, we will have to be visionary, steadfast, and fiercely principled. We have to remember, Sharon Brous says, the deepest, darkest darkness is the moment just before the dawn. The contours of the joyous morning we yearn for will be shaped by the boldest and most imaginative dreams we allow ourselves to dream from within this weepy night. This is no end. It's a new beginning. Rabbi Brous has laid it out for us, and I believe her to be right. We have to know that we are standing on holy ground, and it is up to us to increase the holiness in the world, to do the hard work that Stacey Abrams has given us as an example of transforming a state like Georgia by doing the hard work and asking for God's blessings as we face the road ahead. Shabbat Shalom, everybody, and I'm deeply moved to be with you in this work, in this time, and in this place. Shabbat Shalom.